graduated, elevated. Now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves, take it to the top one time, non-stop.
Hello and welcome to PhD Hard Talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Alex Foden, for coming back again for the second time round to have a conversation with me. Lovely. Could you please introduce yourself, your research, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Dr. Alex Foden. I did a master's degree in physics at the University of Leicester. That finished in 2015. I then spent a year and a half working full-time as a magician of all things before starting a PhD at Imperial College in the material science department, which is part of their engineering department. My PhD looked at something called electron backscatter diffraction, which we talked about in my very first interview on here. So if you want to go back and look at that, get reviews up. If you want to go back and have a look at that, we go into a lot more detail there. But in brief, atoms that make up everything and that make up metals in particular, if you put them in a scanning electron microscope and you bombard the surface with electrons, the electrons interact with the atoms and bounce back, and you get nice pretty patterns, and then you can go from those patterns to what that means the atoms are doing on the surface of a metal. Since then, I started working as a senior systems engineer at BAE Systems, where I've been looking at developing radar. I can't talk too much about that because of NDAs and National Secrets Act and various other bits and pieces to do with that. But radar essentially is shining a massive light and then looking to see what comes back and seeing if you've got any things that shouldn't be there, for instance, planes or helicopters, or alternatively knowing where things that should be there are a bit more accurately than perhaps you might get for things like GPS. I'm back at BAE Systems now, but I did leave BAE Systems for about a year, where I was working at a company called Teledyne E2V. Teledyne E2V is a very interesting company. I didn't gel quite with the company, but the people there were amazing. The company itself make CMOS and CCD devices, which are essentially the computer chips for cameras, and they go on satellites. At least a bit of the company that I was working for was. So yeah, my job was to sort of look at getting all of the test equipment, but you need to test various different bits and pieces of those electronic components ready and on time, and then those bits would go up into space and become parts of satellites, really. I'm now back at BAE Systems again as a senior systems engineer, and it's my job to design the software that takes the data coming in from a radar pulse and says we have an aeroplane, or we have a wind farm, or we have some surface or whatever, and that's sort of what my job is at the moment. So yeah, that's sort of been my career progression so far since finishing my PhD in April 2021. I finished my PhD, so it's been
No, that is lovely, and I'm so glad that your career is moving forward. But we're going to go back to your research, just for anybody who wants a quick overview. So in terms of your research, then going back to it, what was your contribution to the body of knowledge?
We have a Rubik's Cube here, and we have a Rubik's hexagonal prism here. But for the purposes of this, they don't need to be Rubik's. They could just be normal cubes. So when you have something like a metal, atoms like to arrange themselves in nice regular shapes. Cubes, hexagonal prisms. But sometimes they skew themselves ever so slightly. So what should be square or cuboid is actually slightly not square or not cuboid. Now what this means is sometimes the atoms will be this way, or they'll be this way, or they'll be this way, and that doesn't really matter in some circumstances, but it does matter if they're twisted like this, because that is not then the same as that, and it breaks what's called the rotational symmetry of how the atoms arrange themselves. So the atoms are essentially the building blocks of everything, and they will sit on the corners of this. And if you imagine there's a corner, sometimes I'll be here. If you imagine there's a corner, that's where the atoms all sit. Sometimes you'll have things like this next to each other, and sometimes you'll have lots of these next to each other. You'll have them in different sort of relative orientations. So they might be sort of sitting like this next to each other. And that's important because that changes the properties of the material that you're using. Now, we have, when you shoot electrons at them, the electrons interact with the atoms and they make a nice pretty pattern. And that pattern looks like just a load of lines on the screens, and that sort of comes from the planes here. So this one would have a line here, it would have a line coming from here, a line coming along here, a line along here, and you would see sort of like a cross section of those lines. Now, when shapes are simple, like a cube, that's really easy to go from pattern to this. We have something called a Hoof transform. Without going into too much detail, that transfers all of those lines into single points, which a computer is very good at finding. But as things start getting a bit more complicated, like this, or when you get lots of different complicated things next to each other, our current method of distinguish, or the previous best method of distinguishing them, the Hoof transform, wasn't very good. So what my contribution was to develop what's called a pattern matching algorithm to look at what the shapes are, what shapes the atoms are arranged in metals. So the way that you do that is you generate a whole library of patterns. So you go, well, if it looks like this, you'll get this pattern. If it looks like this, you'll get this pattern. If it's like this, and you search through all of this library of patterns and you go, this is the best match. And then it might be that this is what the actual orientation is, and it might say that this is the best match. And then it will say, but when what you need to do is rotate it a little bit this way and rotate it, rotate it a little bit this way, or rotate it a bit that way and rotate it, and you just sort of nudge it into the right space. So my contribution to the pool of knowledge is to have developed a new algorithm to go from what pattern we see to what we see on the what the atoms are doing, and that helps in cases that the atoms are arranged in slightly more complex orientations, which is getting more and more common as alloys get more and more advanced and whatnot. So that's hopefully a fairly concise and hopefully fairly clear summary of what my research was when I was doing my PhD. And again, we went into more detail about that in my very first
previous video. No, thank you very much. That was very insightful, because I think now I get atoms from the previous video and this discussion today. So the next question is, I know your life has changed since being in academia, but I'm sure someone's asking themselves, why did you then apply for a PhD if you knew you weren't staying in academia?
So the answer is I didn't know I wasn't staying in academia. In fact, I wanted to stay in academia. It's the reason I got a PhD. A PhD beat that out of me. So when I applied to do a PhD, the plan was I initially went to university with the intention of doing a PhD. So when I was in high school, I was very much a fan of being on stage. I was in school band, I was in county band, I was in school plays. So I was on stage quite a lot, and I knew I enjoyed performing and being in front of large groups of people. And I also loved learning. I really enjoyed learning about things like black holes and atoms and bits in my physics classes. I enjoyed learning about chemical reactions in my chemistry classes. I enjoyed doing maths. I knew I enjoyed learning. And my little 15-year-old brain went, how can I combine the two of these together? And then I added in that I like teaching as well. So when I was doing my A-levels, a number of friends of mine asked me to help them with their GCSE maths, and I tutored them through their GCSE maths, and they passed in some small part due to me. So I got a real thrill from educating people. I got a real thrill from learning things. I got a real thrill from being on stage, and I was like, you know what? I should be an academic, because then I get paid to teach people, I get paid to stand in front of lots of people and talk about my research, and I get to do research. I get paid. You know, it's the best. It's the best of all three things that I want to do. So at 15, 16 years old, I started looking into what do you need to do to be able to be a university lecturer. And the first thing it said was you need to do a PhD. And I was like, right, brilliant, I'll do a PhD. So what do I need to do a PhD? Well, you need a master's. Okay, so I applied to loads of integrated master's courses. So I don't actually have a bachelor's. I went straight through on an integrated master's, a 4-year course, went from nothing to master's degree in bypassing the bachelor's. And what that meant was it was a little bit cheaper for me to get a master's. Did that in physics. Everything's going incredibly well. Applied for loads of PhD positions. I'm going to be a lecturer. I've got, I've got a nice shiny master's. I've got to apply for loads of PhD positions. It's going all well, and then I didn't get a PhD position at all. And I became self-employed as a magician. And I was self-employed for about 1.5 years. My full-time income was performing. And throughout all this time, I was like, this is all really fun, but I still want to be a lecturer. I still want to be an academic. I still enjoy science. I still enjoy learning. And although I'm performing now, I still love being on stage. And I was like, I'm going to keep applying for PhD positions. And I did. And I got offered one at Imperial College, and I accepted it. And about 1 year in, I was like, actually, academia isn't the job that I thought it was. There's lots of how can I say kindly? There's lots of. I don't want to be mean, because there are upsides to academia. There are benefits to academia as well, but there's lots of things I consider to be negative about academia. There's lots of people trying to steal your work. You have to go to a conference and you have to be careful about what you say, because you don't want people to steal a bit of work that you've spent 1 year working on. When I went to my first conference, my lecturer said to me, you can talk about this, and this in your research, but you can't talk about this, and this, because they might steal it and then you won't have a PhD. And I was like, well, I don't like that. And then I saw the job of a lecturer, which is a little bit of research and a little bit of teaching and a little bit of all the bits that I wanted, but it's a lot of unpaid peer reviews. You have to have the university pay journals to publish your research, and then you have to pay the journals to then see the research. There's lots of grant proposal work. There's lots of admin. There's lots of applying for talks at conferences. There's lots of going and whatnot. And then the idea of having to do 3 or 4 postdoctoral research positions to be able to then be qualified to be a lecturer at that point was a bit less than ideal, I'll say. I was at that point, I was like, well, I want to start thinking about settling down. I want to think about maybe saving to buy a house. And if I want a mortgage, I need a stable income. And I don't have a stable income if I'm a PDRA. And there's no guarantee that I'll even be in the same city or the same country for my next short-term contract. So there's no stability. And then I realized that to be a good academic, you only have to be an academic. You can't enjoy anything else. And as this conversation has probably shown so far, I enjoy things besides academia. I paint. I did these behind me. I like solving Rubik's cubes and doing magic and going out and performing, and I've got guitars over there that I like to play, and I like to read and write, and there's lots of things that I like doing besides academia. And to be a successful academic, to my mind, from what I've seen, although you can have 1 or 2 extra hobbies, you need to be very much sort of, this is my research, and I'm there. So that's sort of why I decided to leave academia. And it took me until I was 2 years into doing my PhD to realize that. And then I had 1 year or so while I was still doing my PhD where I didn't really know what I was going to do. And it took me really until I was most of the way through my PhD anyway to decide that I didn't want to stay in academia and that I would go and get a job in aerospace and defense is where I ended up, but like a non-academic job essentially. Well, it is an academic job, but it's not in academia. So Yeah, I did a PhD because I wanted to be an academic. I wanted to stay in academia. But it just turns out that academia wasn't the job, and it wasn't the world, and it wasn't the role that I expected it to be before I had a taste of it.
Thank you very much
No problem.
for sharing. And in terms of your guidance, what advice do you have for somebody who's planning on applying for a PhD now? What three things should they consider before applying? Since you've had reflections and you've looked back and you're like, do you know what? I love talking to people. I love having, a life outside of work in terms of work-life balance. What advice do you have?
So my advice isn't don't do a PhD. I will make this clear right at the front. I do not regret doing my PhD at all. Although I've just spent a few minutes saying why it was horrible, I had a fantastic time doing my PhD. I met my now fiance doing it. I got to travel the world a little bit. I saw a few places that I perhaps wouldn't have seen. I went to America because of it. My name is now on research papers. I've contributed something to society. So I do not regret doing my PhD, and I would never say to someone, don't do a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say do a PhD for the right reasons. So my first bit of advice is make sure that you absolutely love the subject. It is a long time doing a PhD. It is hard work doing a PhD. It is a slog doing a PhD. You have to wake up every day for 3.5, 4, maybe even 5 years and do the same bit of research or similar related bits of research every single day, and it will grind you down. And Noma and I spoke about this earlier. There is what's called a second year slump, which is where your motivation and your work ethic just drops off a cliff. Like you sort of sit down and you question, you're like, why am I doing this? And I don't know any PhD student who hasn't done that. So my first bit of advice is make sure you absolutely love the subject that you're doing. Make sure you wake up thinking about that subject, or at least there is enough of a subject that drives you and gets you going to do it. The second bit of advice is, as much as you love it, do you necessarily need to do it? Consider whether or not you need to do the PhD. For pretty much every job that is a non-academic job, you're not really at a significant advantage having a PhD. The only benefit that doing a PhD did for me was that I went in at a senior systems engineer, and I went in at a bit more money than if I'd have just gone in with a master's and maybe done a grad scheme or something like that. So you maybe start a little bit higher, but as soon as you're in, having a PhD counts for pretty much nothing. So my second bit of advice would be really consider whether or not you need to do a PhD. And they're the two bits of advice that I would definitely give. The third bit of advice would be to, if you decide to do a PhD, or if you're on the cusp of doing a PhD, maybe weigh up the other options and decide whether or not you think a PhD is necessarily the best one. So if you go for option one and you say, I absolutely love the subject, and you go to option two and you say, well, I don't really need it for what I want to do, but I would like it. My third bit of advice would then be to weigh up other options. Maybe if you want to do a PhD but also work, maybe look at doing a PhD through a company, which would put you in a significantly better financial position at the end of it. Look at maybe doing just going into work and doing something that you love as a job straight off the bat. Really explore other options before sort of narrowing it down into doing a PhD is what I would suggest. I think they would be sort of like my three bits of advice. The first two particularly, I think I would give to pretty much anyone who was considering doing a PhD, which was consider how much you enjoy the subject and if you actually need to do a PhD.
Thank you very much. And
No problem.
this moves us on to the next topic, which is you being a senior systems engineer. So where we will start is the application process, because I know applying for a job is like applying for a PhD. You may beg to differ.
Worse. It's so much worse.
But if you could just take us through that, because I know that your mental health is challenged when you're applying for jobs and you're receiving those emails that just go, unfortunately, and that's a trigger. So, please do share.
So the application process for getting a job is horrendous at the moment. There's not that many jobs out there. So I have an engineering background, so I'm going to have to talk about engineering specifically. I know that people who are doing this might not necessarily have an engineering background. There's people who do PhDs in history and in politics and all of the different subjects as well. That English and I can't talk about those because I've not got a PhD in my subject is a STEM subject, so I'm going to have to talk about STEM, primarily engineering jobs. And I would say that the job market at the moment is very tough and very competitive. There's lots of people applying for jobs, lots of very talented people applying for jobs, and there's not that many jobs out there. So the first thing is resilience. You're doing a PhD anyway, you have resilience. You've applied to do a PhD anyway, you have that resilience. But I would suggest, as annoying as it is while you're writing up, to be applying for jobs while you're writing up, or in your final year of your PhD, start applying for jobs sort of early. Just so that you have that flexibility to apply for lots of jobs. And a lot of jobs, if you say I'm doing this until this date, if you interview 6 months before your submission date, say I'm doing a PhD, can I start after this 6 months? A lot of them will say yes, or the companies worth working for will say yes. But in engineering, the knowing what to search for is difficult. I've tried keywords, so I did a lot of work in MATLAB. So getting skills that go alongside things like coding would be good. So Kubernetes is a bit of software that a lot of people use, but if you're applying for software jobs, would be very useful to know about. Or GitHub or things like that. If you're going into engineering, know about things like the V model, actually, do some research. So just briefly, the V model for engineering is what system engineering is sort of based on, which is you have some requirements and then you go from those you have, in essence, we want this. Okay, well, to do that, we're going to have to do this. To do all of these things, we're going to need to do all of these things. To do all of those things, we're going to need to do these things. Okay, we'll make it. Now we'll test all of these things. We'll test all of these things, and we'll test all of these things. And you sort of do all of that. And there's lots of sort of toing and froing and different ways of doing it. But learn about things like the engineering life cycle, because they will ask about that. With regards to interviews, prepare. If you know about the company, if you go to the interviews with ideas, if you go to the interview with questions and relevant questions, that will put you in better stead. One of the questions that I always ask at the end of an interview is there anything that I can address now that you have a concern about with my application? Which lets you just address any problems that you have, but talk about make sure you go there sort of knowing what the company is about. Don't be afraid of sites like CV Library or Indeed or Monster or Reed or any of them. In fact, put your CV on as many of them as you can, and you will have recruiters get in touch with you, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad, because I don't think recruiters necessarily read your CV. At one point I put I can't remember exactly what it was now, but I remember that I wrote something on the first line of my CV was, I do not want to do this type of work. And then they phoned me up and were like, would you be interested in doing this type of work? And I was like, have you actually read my CV? So be prepared for lots of questions, lots of phone calls that potentially go nowhere. But the biggest thing is resilience. Like you have to learn that you are going to get rejections. You have to learn not to take it personally. And you have to learn that the candidate pool has got lots of very talented and very experienced people in it as well. So yeah, resilience I think is probably the best thing, and spread yourself out, network, get on LinkedIn, talk to people as well. I got my PhD through nepotism. So I knew.
We mentioned it in the previous video.
Yeah, I had a friend from university that I met her at university, and she was studying for a PhD, and she put my name forward to who became my supervisor. So don't be afraid to use any contacts you have as well. Network, get out there, talk to people, go to events, get yourself seen and heard, and then once you get in, be nice to people, like work out who's in charge, and just be friends with them basically. Look, but yeah, the interview process, I know it's stressful. It does eventually get better. People do eventually get back to you. Just keep at it. Unfortunately, there's no secret other than resilience and just trying to be nice to people and try and be yourself, I guess, really. So yeah.
No, thank you very much. And the
No
question I
problem.
have is, how does one manage rejection? Because you get a lot more rejection than a yes or an interview.
Asking the deep questions now. Give yourself time to grieve. I applied for a job at a company that makes software for so what they were doing, they had some software to analyze the tires of trucks. So they analyzed the pressures and the tread depth and things like that using cameras and software and whatnot. And I thought it was a really interesting company. I got an interview there, and I thought the interview went really well, and I was properly excited about working there. And I got a rejection email, and I was pretty upset about that. And I spoke to my dad about it, and he says, "Well, you're probably too good for it." And I was like, "What?" He said, "Well, I was sort of going, are you doing a virtual interview? I was going to and from, doing the bits, and I heard bits of the interview." And he said that the guy who was interviewing you was jealous of some of the ideas and some of the bits that you'd come out with. So I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." So I sort of reframed that interview as well, maybe I was too good for that job, or maybe that wasn't the best company to work for if that was the way they were going to treat it. And I don't know for certain that that's what happened, but that helped me deal with that one. Another one was a software company, and they asked me to do a programming thing. They came up with this really bizarre language and asked some strange questions, and I didn't get past this can you code into section. And I was speaking to a friend of mine afterwards who was a software programmer, who is a software developer, software engineer. And he was saying this is a really weird interview. He said, like, if someone had given me this interview, I'd have walked out, like this questionnaire, I'd have walked out. He said it was unfair, and it was basically him trying to show off how clever he was to you by doing this interview, and that sort of helped. So I guess the first thing is talk to people about it. Don't keep it bottled up. You are going to be upset about it, and talking to people who are in positions that you perhaps want to be in, or you're talking to your friends about it, will help you reframe that rejection. And my next bit of advice is sort of continuing on from that. Try and reframe it. Don't see it as a rejection. See it as experience. See it as okay, that interview didn't go particularly well. Why didn't it go well? Treat it as a learning experience. Treat it as a way to get better. Another thing, weirdly, and I don't know if this is necessarily a good thing, go on TikTok. There's loads of people on TikTok who are talking about all of the rejections they've got, and that will just help you see that you're not alone. but yeah, let yourself be sad. Like if you have an interview, don't apply for a job. Don't set yourself up to apply for jobs afterwards. If you've got an interview or you get a rejection, let yourself take a day off. Let yourself process that and let yourself get over it as well. I think they're probably my bits of advice. Try and reframe it. Try and talk to people about it, and let yourself be upset about it. Like especially if it's a job that you particularly want and you don't get. Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to go about doing it. It also helps as well if you are applying for another job. So if you're in a fortunate position like I am to have a job and you decide to apply for other jobs, if you like the job you've got and you don't necessarily need to get out of there, it puts you in a really good position to be able to go, actually, no, I don't want that job. And I've done that as well. I've rejected jobs before now because I was like, I've got a job but I like. This job is either too similar or it's not worth the pay rise or this, that, and the other. And yeah, not really bothered for it. So, and it's very nice to be in a position of a rejecter as well. But also bear in mind it's not personal. None of it's personal. Like either you're not what they're looking for, you don't meet some sort of diversity quota, or you don't. There's other better qualified candidates than you that are applying as well. You don't know what the candidate pool is. You don't know all of this sort of stuff. You can just do your best and then don't take it personally when a rejection comes. So yeah, I think there's some vague advice in there somewhere. Hopefully someone can decipher it.